Yeah, so I was just saying the one major criticism results from the fact that these tribunals don't have their own police force and so on. So they rely on cooperation with the states and governments that they're dealing with to hand over suspects to the court. So they can only really operate in collaboration with governments, because the governments will supply the police to go and arrest people and turn them into the court. So I was given an example of the UN Tribunal for Sierra Leone. In Sierra Leone, they relied on the government of Sierra Leone to arrest the suspects and hand them to the court. So they needed the cooperation of that government. But of course, if you think about if you're dealing with a government to prosecute crimes committed during an earlier civil war, well, of course, that government is going to be the side who won the civil war, isn't it? So there's this idea of what's called victor's justice at work, which is that, in a civil war, usually all sides will have committed atrocities. But of course, the government of the country, in other words, the side that won the civil war, is only really going to want to hand over people from the other side, the people who lost. And this has been a pattern in these tribunals. For example, one big criticism made of the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda is that it only prosecuted Hutus. No Tutsis were prosecuted. Now, the majority of deaths were of Tutsis at the hands of Hutus, but there was certainly atrocities and massacres committed by Tutsis. But of course, the Tutsi government of Rwanda wasn't interested in handing over those people, and the tribunal itself needed the cooperation of the Tutsi government of Rwanda, so it didn't press the issue. So here we can see what we mean by victor's justice. These tribunals need the cooperation of the governments involved, and those governments are, by what would you call it? Well, basically those governments are the side that won whatever conflict you're talking about. Same thing in Yugoslavia. The Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia is heavily criticized for mainly prosecuting Serbs. There were three sides in the Yugoslav civil war: Serbs, Croats, and so-called Bosnian Muslims. All three committed terrible atrocities and massacres, and it was mainly, not exclusively, but vast majority Serbs who were hauled before the tribunal. So there's a feeling that the Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia was kind of had an anti-Serb bias, that the Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda had an anti-Hutu bias. And this is a reflection and a consequence of the fact that the tribunals themselves rely on cooperation from the governments, which by their very nature are going to be the sides that won whatever civil war we're talking about. Okay. So this brings us to, and a final criticism, you could say, is obviously that these were only temporary tribunals looking at very specific conflicts. And in order to address this limitation, that led to the creation of the International Criminal Court in 2002, which was basically to make a permanent court that could try war crimes, and whose remit would be, his jurisdiction would be, potentially the whole world, or as much of the world as it could. So really the International Criminal Court was a kind of taking the basic idea of these tribunals to prosecute individuals for war crimes, but making it into a permanent body that could try individuals from all over the world. So that was the idea. At present it has, I believe, 124 states that signed up to the International Criminal Court, that recognize its jurisdiction, and that therefore the criminal court itself can prosecute people from within those states. So that's quite impressive. That's arguably evidence of success, that 124 member states have signed up to this International Criminal Court, have voluntarily put themselves under the jurisdiction of this court, which can try people from any of those 124 states for war crimes. In fact, specifically, it's war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity that the International Criminal Court has a remit to try people for. And again, the fact that it can prosecute individuals, unlike the ICJ or the ECHR, does mean that it can act as a deterrent to prevent impunity of other leaders and government officials who might be considering committing violate gross violations of human rights. So it's had some convictions, especially arising from the Congolese Civil War. Thomas Lubanga and Jermaine Katanga, one of whom was convicted of using child soldiers in the Congolese Civil War, and the other of conducting massacres. They've both been convicted. And several indictments have been made, including against the Sudanese president, Omar al-Bashir. One limitation, well, several limitations though, of the International Criminal Court, and several criticisms that have been made of it. One major limitation, that there are, well, a lot of countries that haven't signed up to it, which means it doesn't have jurisdiction over individuals in those countries. And that includes the world's biggest country, Russia, the world's most populous country, China, the world's wealthiest and most powerful country, the USA, and the world's second most populous country, India. So just those four alone, that's a huge number of people that are basically exempted from the jurisdiction, or outside the jurisdiction of the ICC. In fact, it's estimated about 70% of the world's population is actually outside the jurisdiction of the court. So that's quite a major omission. Another problem, it has been accused, or another criticism I should say, it's been accused of political bias, of having a pro-Western bias, and it's been accused even by the African Union, no less, of actually racism. This is due to the fact that of its, I think that 30 plus anyway, indictments, that's when it's called for the arrest and prosecution of someone, every single one has been against Africans. Yeah, they've never issued an indictment against anyone except an African. So the African Union has argued, well, this is a racist court, basically. You might consider this from why would it have only indicted Africans? There's war crimes and abuse of human rights happening all over the place. Well, one reason might be because so many other countries are outside the jurisdiction of the court. But it might also be, if you're thinking about it politically, politically speaking, Africa is probably one of the weaker continents. It doesn't have so much clout, it doesn't have a member on the UN Security Council, it's not economically a powerful united force in the same way that, say, the EU is, or North America is. So there's an argument perhaps that basically other countries are able to mobilize their power and resources to prevent their citizens being indicted, whereas so it's just kind of Africans that are left, they're the ones that are indicted. So this is obviously a major problem and results in some major criticisms. Another element of this political and pro-Western bias is that it has no, this is very important, it has no remit to try crimes of aggression. Now, crimes of aggression are when you invade another country, illegally invade another country. Remember, there's only two legal justifications for invading another country. One is if it invaded you, you can then go to war with that country in self-defense. And secondly, if the United Nations Security Council has basically authorized an invasion to take place in order to prevent what do they call it, a breach of international peace and security. So basically, if there's an invasion takes place that's not self-defense and that hasn't been authorized by the UN Security Council, as for example was the case with the 2003 invasion of Iraq, that was clearly not fought in self-defense. Iraq hadn't attacked Britain and the US, and it hadn't been authorized by the UN Security Council. France, Germany and Russia and China were all against it. So with those cases, those are called crimes of aggression, illegal invasions, and the criminal court has no remit to try crimes of aggression. So some people say that, well, this is a major omission and this is a major example of its pro-Western bias because this is the main war crime that the West itself is responsible for, illegal invasions of other countries. The 1999 bombing of Serbia in relation to Kosovo, that was also a NATO operation without UN approval. But the ICC has no remit to try crimes of aggression. When it was originally first conceived in the 1998 Conference of Rome, it was called. Originally it was to have, the idea is that it would have a remit to try crimes of aggression, but that actually was dropped out, which is why, even though there are 166 states that signed the Rome Treaty in '98, which was a treaty that sort of set into action the process of creating the criminal court, only 124 of those actually signed up to the International Criminal Court, because many of them protested the fact, well, why doesn't it have a remit to try crimes of aggression? You know, the war in Iraq is estimated to have killed upwards of 1 million people. Surely this is a very major crime, and yet the ICC has no remit to prosecute for that. So they can't prosecute Tony Blair, for example, for the illegal invasion of Iraq, because that's a crime of aggression. It doesn't have the remit to prosecute. So those are some of the criticisms and limitations of the International Criminal Court. So in sum, I think all of these outfits, the European Court of Human Rights, the ICJ, the ad hoc UN tribunals and the ICC, they've all had some success in deterring human rights abuses or upholding or preventing human rights abuses, but they've all definitely got their limitations, and one of the main big limitation underlying all of this is the fact that there is no the international law, if you like, is by its nature anarchic, because there's no supreme authority, supreme global authority that can actually enforce international law. So the more powerful states can always refuse to abide by the rulings of these courts and so on, or not sign up to the jurisdiction of these courts, and that's what we've seen time and again. So there's no supreme supranational authority that can really enforce human rights effectively across the globe, and that's the problem underlying all of these mechanisms. That means fundamentally all of these mechanisms are very limited, but that's not to say they're useless. I think